Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be watching this. I'm Steve Thorpe. I'm a captain on a G550 with Merck. I'm also the Director of Training and Standards for the Merck Flight Department. And with me is Mitch Lanus from 30 West IP.
Hi, Steve. Good morning. Morning, everybody.
Now, we're going to talk about oceanic best practices. And the discussion is based on U.S. registered general aviation operator. Your specific limitations and restrictions can be found in your OPSPEC/LOA, and that's what will be particular to your operation. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to ask a series of questions about oceanic best practices. Why do we do things the way that we do things? So the first question is, why do I need to complete a plotting chart? My aircraft MFD and EFB have been very accurate with moving maps and on-ship positioning. Now the answers to all these questions are going to be based on AC 9170 Bravo. Right, Mitch?
That's right. And we're going to use this as a resource throughout the discussion. And this is the best practices. This is what the FAA expects of a US-based operator. So in addressing the first question, there are two different resources within the advisory circular that address it. And the first one I'm going to borrow from is Appendix D, which talks about the sample oceanic checklist. And in the flight planning section, it identifies that your checklist should include a requirement for a plotting chart. And then it goes on to specify plotting from the route coast out to the route coast in and equal time points associated with that route. It goes on in the checklist to specifically identify that ICAO groups that review oceanic errors have determined that the routine use of the chart is an excellent, and if I could just borrow, effective way to reduce lateral errors. And regardless of the technology that we have in our cockpit today, lateral errors continue to plague oceanic operations, and we're constantly trying to employ the tools that will help reduce that. Now, in a different section of the advisory circular, chapter 6, that talks about oceanic practices, they specifically have a section dedicated to plotting and orientation charts. And in here, they identify that the chart should include at a minimum the route of your filed flight plan or effective route clearance. Now, if you get a reroute, they expect that that reroute would be reflected on your plotting chart. And that's one of the things that sometimes gets neglected. So we want to point that out, and we'll probably touch on that later. Your depiction of standardized symbology for each of the waypoints. Now, in some of the older maps, we would have to create a little X or a circle or something, but Jeppesen on their plotting chart, which you may use another plotting chart, but Jeppesen has waypoint symbology on their chart. The graphic depiction of all ETPs and alternate airports, as well as the proximity of adjacent tracks when those tracks are in effect. So if there was a track north of you and a track south, you'd plot both of them. It doesn't say you have to plot all the tracks, that you might do that, but you would plot adjacent tracks. So what would that look like? Now, I'm going to give you an example here on a Jeppesen plotting chart. And as I mentioned, you might not be using a Jeppesen plotting chart, but here on this chart, track Romeo is our route. And the nearest adjacent route is track Sierra. There is no track north of us. So I annotate that, and I use some sort of different symbology. And then I have the equal time points. And in blue, I would go back to Gander, and I've identified Gander. And up here, I would go on to Shannon, and I've identified Shannon. And then the middle section is where I would divert and go up to Keflavik, and I'm showing it in a different color. Now, you don't have to use colors as we display here. We're using colors just simply to help to graphically represent it, but I think that this does illustrate how valuable colors can be in the depiction of the different items. Now, back to the advisory circular. As we talk about the plotting chart, there's a note, and it's a really important note, and it talks about how for Part 91 operators, an electronic flight bag can be used, provided that electronic flight bag meets the FAA considerations of acceptable software and equipage. So there are various organizations, companies that support electronic plotting, and you're probably aware of them. But in this particular illustration, this is a wonderful graphic. It shows the route of flight. It shows each of the ETPs, and then it shows the divert points that you'd be going to. And in this particular version, you can see the tracks that would be in effect, and in purple would be in effect during the period of time that we're going to be utilizing. So that would vary depending upon what the time of day was that you're crossing. So that's just a little bit about plotting. You don't have to use one kind of chart. You don't have to use one kind of software, but it is not just a best practice, but an expectation of the FAA.
Hey, Mitch, we've got data link. Why do we still need to do a 10-minute check?
This question gets asked a lot. So let's take and go back to the advisory circular that we previously discussed and see what the FAA has to say about it. The check of aircraft position at approximately 10 minutes following the waypoint passage is designed to enable you to observe and correct navigational error before safety of flight is jeopardized. So that's the history of it. It's been in use for a long time. The history seems to indicate that it's very effective. And we'll give you some operational insights as to how that might affect you and your operation. But they don't just leave it as a suggestion. They reiterate in the advisory circular that cross-checking of navigation during oceanic remote operations is mandatory under ICAO standards. Now, I've talked a lot about how ICAO creates standards, but those standards aren't enforceable unless the state of registry decides that they're mandatory. And in this particular case, not only is it an ICAO standard, but the FAA mentions it as a mandatory standard. So this is something they clearly expect us to do. There are two methods of doing it, and I'm going to identify one, and then Steve is going to talk about another. I'm going to talk about the plotting method, and they note here that the plotting method is appropriate for all aircraft navigation configurations. So this would universally be available to us all. And they mention that it's 10 minutes after the waypoint passage. 10 minutes is about the time it takes for you to be able to show a significant enough error to be detectable. If you check it sooner than that, it can be really difficult to determine that you're off course because you haven't really had the time yet. And if you do it after that at 15 minutes or something, you could have already encroached upon an error that would involve ATC. So 10 minutes is used at 2 degrees is a common method that's acceptable as well. We'll talk about that. So let's go and look. It says verify your plotting and orientation chart reflects the current effective route. Now, Steve, you have some experience with this current effective route because of reroutes. Is there something you might like to add?
Yeah, Mitch, I think it's important that if we get a reroute, we not only go through all the good operational practices that Mitch is going to talk about later about verifying our waypoints, but that a second set of eyes goes over this plotting chart that has been redone for the reroute as well. I've been caught before in doing all our good due diligence about the master document, only to find that I made a 1 degree error on the plotting chart, which we catch later because it looks like we're off course, but we're really not off course. So it's good practice to double check with a second set of eyes any kind of reroute that finds its way onto the plotting chart.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Now let's go to the plotting chart. So here I am in oceanic airspace, and I'm operating about 2 degrees, maybe 10 minutes after waypoint passage. And what I would do is I would find the lat long. I would find out what my current present is, they say here, lat long, and record the time on the chart. And then it notes that you should plot your position using coordinates from the non-steering long-range navigation system. So let's just refer to that as our non-steering FMS, the right side FMS, if you will. And that's even if you're in sync or if you're in dual, that would still be a consideration. So let's look at this graphically. Here you see an MCDU. You may be using an ECDU, and there are various ways to do it, but I've simply gone into the sensors and looked at the FMS for the non-steering side and identified the lat long. Now, it's not uncommon. We would take a picture of this, so we'd have it on our phone for later. But Steve, you do something a little bit different in your operation, don't you?
Yeah, we in our navigation system, we can hit the update of the R1 key, and that brings us to an update page, and then we can actually freeze this position by putting it into our scratch pad, and that's where we can then do all our plotting from that scratch pad held position.
And all we're really trying to achieve here is we're trying to capture where we are at that moment. And so that's an effective way to do that. Now, um, I've taken it and I've illustrated it just like it was suggested. I put the lat long on the map and I put the time on the map. And by coincidence, or perhaps by convenience, or maybe even by expertise, I'm on the route. And that's what we want to see. We want to see it on the route. Now, up here, you see a flight plan. We're going to talk about flight plan annotations later. Not all, but a lot of SOPs, when the 10-minute check is complete, they have some sort of annotation. So I put a strike through. And while we're up here talking about this, I have recorded an ETA for that point. And when I actually flew over it, I recorded the actual time of arrival and the fuel in the next ETA. And Steve, you've seen an incident where operationally, even though you were doing fans, the recording of that, which is part of the practices in the advisory circular, was very important. Can you help us out with that?
Yeah, Mitch. So if you fail to write down your ETA, ATA, and expected next time at the next fix, you could be caught, well, virtually with your pants down, because we had a situation where about halfway to the next waypoint, Shanwick gave us a cell call. We answered cell call, and they said, we did not receive your last CPDLC waypoint position. Could you give us a manual position? Standing by. So if we had not written down as Mitch has here illustrated, the 0125 of the exact passing time and the estimated time at that passing of the previous waypoint, we would have not been able to give them true information. So it's really important, even though we got all the magic working, to still follow that old-fashioned procedure of writing down the actual time of arrival over a fix and the estimated time for the next fix, as well as you can see here, our fuel burn as well. But Mitch will talk about that a little later.
A lot of times when we do these procedures, we're doing them not because we need them for the execution of the immediate task, but for the event that something goes awry so that they can help us to trap that. So there is an important role for that. Now, if there's an error, investigate and take action. If your plotted position does not agree with your currently effective route, then you need to do something about that. So we're going to take an opportunity to look at the plotting method and to explore what happens if there is some sort of a disagreement. And I'm going to also use it to point out another technique in this plotting method. We would not do 10 minutes or I would not do 10 minutes when I was operating. I would use 2 degrees where it was applicable. So here we crossed the 50 west longitude. So at 48 west, when I took this picture, I was right at 48 west. And we'd actually take a timer and set 8 minutes so that we could watch it clock down to 48. And then I just draw a line on the chart that identifies where 48 is. And when I cross 48 and take the picture, I take the 4 digits of the latitude and I plot them on the plotting chart. And what that does is it gives me the ability to capture that location more accurately, in my opinion, and then to identify exactly where it is. So in this instance, it would require an investigation because that point is not on my route. And there's an example of where I've perhaps caught an error. So when this occurs, one of the things you can do as a technique is take your previous waypoint, the one that we had previously crossed, and draw a line through that and go over through this waypoint and see if you're not going to another waypoint. That's going to be your trend line. So using that trend line, I could say, well, now I need to investigate this. Do I have the correct waypoint for the next destination? Now, a lot of feedback has come through training where folks say, you know, this just doesn't happen. We don't see this. How could that be a problem with the technology that we have today? And I would agree that the technology today really offers us a lot of advantages, but I'm going to give you two examples that I know of where this has been very useful to a business aviator out in that airspace. This is a guidance panel, and it's a generic guidance panel, but it has all the elements of a traditional guidance panel. And let's say that we're off route just a little bit, and we look up and we investigate it, and we see this. We're in the heading mode. You perhaps ask yourself, how could I be in the heading mode? Well, maybe you used it to insert slop. It's not a recommended procedure for inserting slop. They discourage you from using the heading mode. But we have seen that happen, and that's why the crew is a little off. And if you capture this by using proper SOPs, then you can actually identify it before ATC might, and then that would help you to recover from it. And it would just be between you and the other guy in the cockpit. But there's another example. You could have the autopilot disengaged inadvertently. And we've seen this as well. So this isn't just a hypothetical. So if your autopilot inadvertently becomes disengaged, the airplane traditionally flies beautifully. They're wonderful airplanes, but you're not using guidance to continue. So these two things are examples of why that check can be very useful, even with all the technology we have engaged today. And they also kind of point out something that's going to come up in the checklist. The next step in the plotting method is to use the steering long range nav, that FMS on the left-hand side, to verify the next waypoint's consistent with your effective cleared route. So here we see an MCDU, and that's where we're coming from, and that's where we're going to, and you can look at it on the waypoint list as well. So there's a couple of different ways that could be illustrated. I kind of prefer this because we can ensure that the lat longs continue to reflect, in fact, what we're going to do. And then the last point in this checklist is going to refer back to what we previously said. Verify your autopilot is steering in the LNAV mode and that you have a proper steering to the next waypoint. And that takes us back over here to, yes, my autopilot is engaged, and yes, I am in the LNAV mode. So that completes a discussion of the plotting method in a traditional sense, in the way we've taught it for years. But a couple years ago, the FAA came up with a new version, and it's called the navigation display version. And Steve's going to talk about this.
Yeah, Mitch, this was not in the old AC. In 9170, it was plot on a chart, and that was the only real way to do that. But when 9170 Bravo came out, and I believe it was with some industry feedback from a lot from the airlines, perhaps for some other methods, the navigation display was found to be appropriate and available for use if you have an operable FMS. And you need a few other things too. It can't be just the FMS. You need a navigation display, as we'll see here. So instead of on a plotting chart, the first thing you do is confirm the aircraft symbol is on the programmed route. Now, the programmed route is only as good as your prior sanity checks provide. So you got to make sure you do all the other checks as well. So in this case, we've lowered our navigation display to the lowest setting, and you say, oh, look, we're off course, aren't we? No, that's slop. So they're slopping right 1 mile. So you check to make sure that you're on the route where you're supposed to be, or you're at least where you think you should be, right 1 mile, right 2 miles, maybe 1.5, whatever, the slop. Next, you check your system-generated cross-track deviation or similar indication of any deviation from the programmed route of flight. Now, this could take the shape of a lot of different ways, but Here's a common place to check is on the progress page. And this is still the same example as we had before. So we are offset right 1 mile, but our cross track is 0 or very nearly 0. So we want to make sure that that cross track error is very nearly 0. Then, just like previously, for the plotting method, use the steering LRNS to verify the two waypoint is consistent with your currently effective route clearance. I guess I mentioned that before. You still got to do all those checks to make sure that what is in your system is what is your clearance. And as Mitch alluded to, the best way to do that is on the exploded lat longs to make sure that 4950N really is north 49 degrees, west 50 degrees. And again, another thing that is exactly the same as your if you were doing on a plotting chart is to verify that your autopilot steering mode is in LNAV, VNAV, or other appropriate mode to ensure steering to the next intended waypoint. I want to add one other thing. Well, there is what the autopilot should look like, and the flight guidance panel should look like. One other thing to mention is that our practice is to make the notations just on both the plotting chart and the master document. The FAA does not really mention that in AC 9170 Bravo that notations are required using the navigation display method, but we think it's probably a good practice to make notations as to the time and perhaps the point and a few other notations so that we can go back and prove that yes, we indeed did do a sanity check as far as position for a 10-minute check.
I think that's real important because otherwise you have no way of being able to indicate that you actually did it. Everything that is in that list could be done without recording it, and only by recording it can you indicate that yes, in fact, that course of action had been followed.
Yep, that's why that was the thought process we used in putting that into our SOPs. So, Mitch, is it really necessary for us to do a flight plan waypoint validation? I think you and I have both mentioned that this validation process with FMS lat long, mag course, and distance when we can actually download a flight plan.
Well, that's another question that we get a lot, and it's addressed in the advisory circular, as we saw before, and in chapter 6 that talks about the execution of a flight. It uses a statement to say that we must verify all navigation information in the master document against the nav data information in the FMS. So, if you want to parse language, must is a pretty clear term. It goes on to say that you should check the expanded coordinates, mag course distance between waypoints against the same information on your master document. And of course, the master document is the computerized flight plan. And then directly addressing the technology, it says, regardless of whether you have an automatic or a manual download of the flight plan into the FMS, these procedures to verify should be executed. Now, some years ago, on my first presentation at the IOC, I made a statement that if you downloaded the flight plan through ACARS, that it would help effectively to reduce those errors on waypoint insertion and kind of ensure that you wouldn't have a problem. Well, that was naive. That was my experience. And at the conclusion of my presentation, I had several people come up and say, that's not correct. I've downloaded bad waypoints. And so I became aware at that time that, yes, you can download bad waypoints. So it is something that does occur. It has occurred, and that's what you're checking against, even if you can do a download. This statement's important. At the top, they said you must verify, and then down here, they go on to state what they don't want you to do. It's not sufficient for one crew member to simply observe another crew member and enter the data. they want you to exercise an independent cross-check method. And I don't think that it would be fair if I didn't note that I've been caught up in a slot and I had to get out based on a release time. And we would say, give me the flight plan. I'm going to read it to you. You check to make sure that it's in there correctly. And that's not really what they want. But then after we met the operational constraint and got airborne, we still had time before entry to go back and do all the procedures that we're going to look at here. And these procedures are often overblown. We're going to take a computerized flight plan and we're going to look at the Oceanic entry point, which is in this case Jopi, and the Oceanic exit point to de Gaulle. And all of those waypoints are the ones we're going to work with. We don't have to do Canada or in the case of Europe, Ireland. And we're going to verify that the waypoint list on our airplane has the same coordinates. That's the first step. So although it may look a little cumbersome, it really is easy once you've done it a couple of times, and it doesn't really take very long. So I take Jopi and I look at the lat long, and I just make sure that the actual airplane is going to go to the same lat longs, and they think Jopi is the same place. And of course, that Jopi is the waypoint. And then I go through each of the waypoints and I ensure that that is in fact the waypoint that I've been planned on in the flight plan and that the coordinates match. And as I go through this, it's really a fairly simple process of ensuring that each of these waypoints is correct. Even if I downloaded the flight plan, there could be an error. And Steve, I believe that you don't have this representation in your flight plan format, but you have another way in which you can get that information, correct?
Yeah, this is really this is the optimal, I think, because it's right there at each waypoint, the expanded waypoint on the master document. Our flight plan provider provides all the waypoint lat longs, but it's in a column at the end of the flight plan. So it's still doable, but to me, this is a preferable way to have your flight plan set up. Something that we're going to have to look into, because if it's harder to do, in other words, if I have to go back to the last page and double check those waypoints against in the paper to glass, if it's harder to do, pilots being human, that is where sometimes this step gets skipped. But your flight plan provider should provide all of the expanded waypoints. It just might not be in this format.
That's a great observation. And I want to close up here. I had annotated that this was paper to glass, and that is we're starting with the paper, and it might be on an iPad. Obviously, that might be the most effective way to do it. But we're taking the master document and comparing it to what the airplane is showing us. And when we read this waypoint, we tend to expect to see that waypoint here, and that's an expectation bias. That's one of the most common errors in the airplane. So we did paper to glass, and when the second pilot works, he reverses this process, and he goes from the FMS back to the master document. And reading from the master document to the FMS, they note here, is seeing what we expect to see, expectation bias. So we're reversing it to mitigate expectation bias. And this is a simple way, and we can express it as paper to glass while a pilot works from glass to paper on the second step. So what would glass to paper look like? The other pilot would then take the MCDU or the ECDU would be appropriate, and he'll check the mag course and distance between these 2 points. Now in this particular flight plan format, obviously there are a lot of different flight plan formats, mag course and distances up here. So we're going to be looking at these numbers down here, and the mag course and distance should match within approximately 5 or 6 degrees of the mag course and 2 to 3 miles of the distance. If you see an error of excess of 3 miles, you're going the wrong waypoint. The mileage is very good indicator of an error. You might see the mag course within plus or minus 2 degrees, but there's a lot of factors that can vary that could make it as much as 5 or 6. So let's take a look here. To go from Jopi to 49 North 050 West is 087 miles. Easy check. Now, in this particular illustration, I'm putting a check mark here to indicate that I've completed that, and I simply follow through. Now, this should be a really masterful way to make sure that you really got the right course and distance, because it's going to tell you if there's an error in your route. This is a super positive way of ensuring you don't have an error in your master document or an error in your flight plan. And at the
And Mitch,
completion of these two, you've really done a great job. Yes, Steve.
yeah, so of course, this all is predicated on the fact that your master document is actually what your clearance is. So if you've gotten a reroute, and if you on the ground get a different clearance, make sure that your master document reflects exactly what that clearance is.
Yes, the FAA permits you to do what they call a cross-out method, where you take your master document and strike out the waypoint information that is no longer valid, and then to manually write in there the correct information so you can use the same document with a reroute. And of course, that would be effective if there were simply a couple of waypoints that change, which is most common. But if all the waypoints changed, it sure would be nice to have a new master document. Now, next is a great question.
Yeah, and why do we do any of this when we got ADSB surveillance? I heard about this magic ADSB. They're looking at us all the time in most of the net, aren't they? Aren't they, Mitch?
In a large part of the NAT, they are, and they can see you in real time. And I think this is a great question. And there may be a day when we may modify what the expectations are, but we haven't arrived at that point yet. And it's identified in a North Atlantic Ops Bulletin 2020-02. Space-based ADSB, which you're probably familiar with, is a private company called Arion, and they have placed ADSB receivers on board all the Iridium satellites and the spares, and they can see ADSB airplanes anywhere in the world. And that's going to create a whole host of wonderful outcomes. But what we're really talking about is, where is it applied currently, in what oceanic sector, and how does it affect us operationally in our best practices? And the only place that it is currently used for separation is Gander Oceanic and Shanwick Oceanic. There are some variations where there's ADSB in other places, but those are the only place where this system can actively track you in real time. So if you're flying through Gander or Shanwick, they can see you in real time, very similar to radar. This bulletin talks about it. And, in the simple terms, if they can see me like I'm on radar, why do I have to use oceanic procedures? So let's take a look. Remember, this came out July of 2020, so it's fairly recent. It's a short bulletin. I'm just going to borrow a couple sentences from it. In the general section, they state that ATS surveillance services, which is a broad term that includes radar and ADSB, have now become more widely available in the North Atlantic region. Within the Santa Maria sector, they have ADSB throughout the Azore Islands, and that's helping them with ATS surveillance. Up in the Iceland sector, they have ATS surveillance widely available, and they actually use Arion, but they're not using it to reduce separation. It's only being used to reduce separation and track in real time in Gander and Shanwick. When it gets to flight crew procedures, in paragraph 3.3, it's bold. They're putting it in bold for a reason. This is the heart and the soul of what this is all about. They're saying, yes, you have surveillance, real-time surveillance in the oceanic sector, but regardless of whether you have surveillance services or not, they want you, the flight crew, to continue to use the SOP procedures and the practices that we just talked about, because they haven't got direct controller to pilot communication via VHF. Now that may change at some future date, but this is unambiguous. They issued a bulletin, they put it in bold, and it is the expectation of ICAO and the FAA for the time. Now, I'm an optimist, and the future is a bright future with new technologies coming out, but we're not quite there yet. Steve, do you want to talk about Slop?
And this question is one that Mitch gets all the time. And do I really need to do slop on a random route or at higher flight levels? And I'm going to take it. I have made a few presentations on that, and I think if I say anything that Mitch doesn't agree with, I'm sure he'll chime in. But let's look at why slop is needed. Back in the days of INS, there was built-in slop because INS drifted with time. So there was a natural left to right meandering of the tracks that people would take. And we just put in here, this would be a track because they're in 1,000-foot increments, 36, 35, and 37. And prior to GPS, you really didn't have the vertical, the probability of a vertical loss of separation was low because of that natural drift. But as GPS was introduced, we are right over each other. So it put us precisely on the center line, 1,000 feet apart, and any kind of error in the vertical navigation produced a risk of collision. And the powers that be, when I say they introduce slop, it's the statisticians that really designed the fact that statistically speaking, we need to introduce these slops. So the strategic lateral offset procedure, or SLOP, reduces the risk of collision. So just the orange line here is the center line, and we're able to manually, via offsets, reintroduce this natural drift that was taking place with INS. So that naturally reduced the risk of a vertical loss of separation.
And I'd like to just add that we did a NBAA webcast on the new contingency procedures in October 28th, if I'm not mistaken. And we did with Steve a bit more of an expansive look at slop than we're doing today, but we're constrained by time today. But it's a really important procedure, and I think we can talk about it in reference to this. So.
Yeah, so it says the 2018 annual safety report, but this carries through right to the present day. And you can see it's the North Atlantic Systems Planning Group. This is a group of those statisticians and operational folks that I talked about earlier. And here's what they found. Incorporating the estimated benefits of strategic lateral offset procedure reduces the vertical collision risk by 78%. 78%. So if I can reduce my risk by 78%, I'm all for that.
That's a big number.
And you see a lot of statistics in there, but really, if you think back to when SLOP was introduced and maybe some hesitancy, they put the carrot out there saying, well, we can't, and these are the statisticians and the ATC folks talking, we cannot reduce the separation, which is what we normally would be able to do if we have increased surveillance, until we meet a target level of adhering to SLOP. We've met that, and so you've seen the reduction in separation. And when we get back to a normal North Atlantic season where we have the normal traffic, we'll be able to put more planes in less space with a reduction in the vertical collision risk.
They go on to talk about how this really needs to be mentioned every time we're in a forum like this. And what Steve said is really important. If you don't practice it, you're not contributing to the safety of the system.
Another reason that I talk about for SLOP on the random route is when you go back to talking about the old school of ground-based nav aids. If you think back to your primary training, your instructor probably told you, hey, really keep your eyes peeled when you're navigating over a ground-based nav aid. Why is that? Because that's where airplanes congregate along their routes. Well, if we think about oceanic airspace, the same thing takes place every 10 degrees of longitude. Airplanes tend to congregate along those points. Plus, if you're in a random route, the likelihood is someone else is on your not so random route as well, because your flight planning agency decided that that was an economical way to go. And if someone's going the same way, they're likely on a very similar route.
That's a real important point. There's almost never a really truly random route.
So, Mitch, do I really need to complete a plotting chart when I'm on an airways routing? Well, for example, in the NOPAC R220 from Alaska to Japan.
This is another really good question, because I'm not on a track. I'm not acting as a random operator on a random route or a user preferred route. So let's take a look at that. This is the chart showing the North Pacific, what we call the NOPAC, and there's 5 primary routes. And those routes operate just like you'd see domestically. They've got the mag course and the distance. They've got 5 character named waypoints, and they've really done a phenomenal job, because they actually name the waypoints with the first letter in each route to reduce error. And it is a very easy system to operate with. But this is the high-low chart, and they actually make a plotting chart, and the FAA has the expectation that you'll plot, because if we look at it, in this particular example, Nickel is, I'm already in the Anchorage Oceanic section at Nickel. I'm right over here. And then down here at Nubda, this is the area that I would expect to start to see possibly radar contact in Fukuoka's airspace. And that distance is over 1,100 miles. And from the point that you lose radar into the point that you pick radar up is almost identical to the North Atlantic, if not just a little bit further. So this is the same type of distances if you're operating in the North Atlantic between Gander and Shanwick. So it's not any less vulnerable to that type of an error. And if we go down into the Central Pacific and look, there's a route structure down here, and this is Romeo 464, and we see the similar type of naming convention for the waypoints. That's considerably further. That's, almost 1,600 miles. So the expectation would be that you're transiting oceanic and remote region, and that you would utilize these procedures. And it really doesn't take a lot of speculation. It's in the advisory circular, but it's also the expectation of the specialists who evaluate operations and investigate errors associated with oceanic operations.
Great points, Mitch. Hey, I've heard a variety of different opinions on this subject, but do I still need to send a position report at the oceanic fur boundary in the Pacific? For example, Oakland, Auckland, Anchorage?
Well, this isn't as cut and dry as all the previous best practices examples. So let's take a look, and I'm going to borrow from Jepson. And in the Pacific Airway Manual, as there is in each regional airway manual, there is a map showing where FANS coverage is available in that airspace. And then there'll be a set of notes about the various regions that are displayed with FANS equipage. And I want to note here that, like Singapore, for example, there's a real short little note here we're going to talk about in Singapore, but to operate on FANS in the Singapore flight information region, there's a whole lot of details in the Pacific ATC section where you go into Singapore. They've got a couple of pages on FANS operations. So this isn't by any means the whole story. This is just what they consider to be some important notes about operating within that region. And I think Steve would agree, if we could have the AIP and we could break out the AIPs for each of these states. I've done that in actual other presentations. We don't have time here. It would show the same information that I'm about to show you, and that'd be a better resource as AIP. But this is extracted from it. What I want to show you here is that 11 flight information regions in the Pacific region currently all share a similar requirement. They want you to confirm CPDLC, current data authority, by sending a CPDLC position report at the FAR boundary. Now, that's not well written, and I'd like to restate it. Upon successful login with the flight information region, the flight crew should initiate a manual CPDLC position report message to the center to confirm they can communicate via CPDLC. It's not about the position. If you have an ADSC contract, they're already getting the location information. It's not about the times that are in the position report. It's about, I can communicate with you. And this program hasn't been a blazing success. And it's applied kind of differently across the region. Oakland and Anchorage had terrible compliance with it. And as a result, they've changed their procedures. And even though this is a current Jefferson publication, this statement here for Oakland and Anchorage is changed. It is going to be in the AIP soon, but you'll see that. And some of you have already seen it when you operate out there. But for many of the other flight information regions, places like Auckland, Brisbane, and what's the other one? Melbourne. If you don't comply with this, they have a practice of sending you a message and telling you to send it. And basically you have failed to comply. So it is a very real, and they want to do it because they want to confirm communication. So I'm going to show you how this is done and how it's done easily. And I'm going to start with Oakland. And Oakland has abandoned the requirement for this, and they simply send you a message like you'd have in the North Atlantic, a welcome message, and you would accept that. So that's being done at Oakland and Anchorage. It's not in the books yet, but we've confirmed it through operations, and then we've also talked to the manager at Oakland about it. It's meant to replace that procedure. But let's just say I'm going to Australia, or let's say I'm going to New Zealand. When I enter those flight information regions, it's really easy to do. I select from my fans menu, or if you're in a Honeywell, it would say ATS menu, ATC menu, and I would select position report. The position report is several pages long, but it's pre-populated. It's not like it's a lot of work. You're simply reviewing that it is filled out. There's page 2. And the third page in most of the software formats is simply the ability to send a free text message if you feel that that's significant. And there's no reason that you would. And then what you do is you'd send it. You'd verify it and you'd send it. So basically, you select the position report, you go verify, 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 send, and the position report goes out and it confirms communication. Now that really completes our discussion of the particular questions for best practices that we were able to assimilate from training and from NBAA events. But we're going to look at a couple of follow-up things here, and Steve will talk a little bit about this.
So here's what we've discussed, Mitch mainly, with me a little bit of my input, what a properly annotated flight plan should look like. Now, we say properly annotated in that these are the minimum requirements. You need some method of showing that you verified the waypoint, some method that you verified track and distance, some method that you have completed a 10-minute check, and then your times and fuel. Those are really the minimum requirements. Now, your SOPs may have more that is required to be annotated, but these are the minimum as laid out in AC 9170 Bravo.
Yeah, and more is not bad, but this is what the expectation is that's laid out in the advisory circular. So that's a properly annotated flight plan.
And if we look at the properly annotated plotting chart, in our operation, this looks fairly bare because most of us in our SOPs, we put in a few more things. Most of the time we'll put in all the tracks depending on where they are. Most of the time we have a few more ETPs. Perhaps if they're more than 100 miles apart, we will break them out between medical and engine out and depressurization. And then at each 10-minute check, we have a little flag where we're also doing altimeter check. But that's above and beyond. So you can add more to it. But per the AC, you need the route, the cleared route, adjacent tracks, ETPs, along with ETP airports, see that they're circled here on this chart, and then the positions of your 10-minute check. So again, by properly annotated, this is the minimum. And as Mitch said, more is not necessarily worse. Colors, you may want to get, you may have a whole selection of colored pencils or pens that you use, and that's fine, whatever your SOP is. But this kind of gets to the minimum.
Yeah, and this has to be both these documents should be retained for a minimum of 6 months. And that's so that if there's a problem with Shanwick, it might take Shanwick 3 or 4 weeks to be able to properly identify something they have a question about. They're going to forward it to the FAA, and it might take them 4 or 5 weeks to be able to process this. They want you to retain this for 6 months so that prior to that time, if they reached out and wanted to discuss a potential error, that you'd be able to demonstrate that you had complied with these best practices. So what we'll do now is we're going to go to a question and answer period, and Steve and I will be available to try to answer any of the questions that may have come up during the discussion. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mitch. Great to be with you.